Welcome back, guys. Today we are going to begin looking at evolution, which is unit 7, so 7 of 8. Um, so we're going to do a quick introductory piece here, talk about kind of where these ideas for evolution comes from, talk about Darwin, talk about kind of his journeys and travels. We'll talk just a bit about natural selection and artificial selection, what the difference is, and then give you a classic example from evolution, these Galapagos finches, where we can see evidence of evolution by natural selection. Okay, so we're just going to go ahead and jump off into it here. Um, we are talking about, this is going to be our intro to evolution. All right, intro to evolution. Okay, so what we've talked about previously in units 5 and 6, this unit really marries those two ideas together quite nicely. So the raw material for evolution is going to be this variety. So it's the variation that's provided by what we've discussed previously in unit 5 and 6. So that would be mutations and these allele interactions. Dominance, recessiveness, codominance, and complete dominance, multiple alleles, all of these things that give us the traits and this variety. And then what we'll see is some mechanisms that act on that, and that essentially is evolution. So we're going to give you a definition here for evolution. We're going to say evolution is the change in allele frequencies which essentially is a percentage in a population over time. Right? And many of these ideas come from Charles Darwin. So we'll get a look at Darwin here. Right, so this is what Charles Darwin looks like. You might see a picture of him. He lived in the 1800s. And what he ended up doing is he circumnavigated the globe in 5 years, collecting evidence that species change over time. Right, so this is his journey. The ship was called the HMS Beagle, Her Majesty's ship Beagle. So he was able to board this ship as a naturalist in 1831, and they left Plymouth and they sailed around the coast of Europe here, down between South America and Africa. They headed then out around the tip of South America to the Galapagos off the coast of Ecuador, across the Pacific, around Australia, through Asia, around Africa, and then back home to Falmouth in 1836. So a 5-year voyage collecting evidence of flora and fauna and that species change over time. What he's seeing is that organisms from the New World over here in the Americas and the Old World over here in Europe, Asia, Australia, there is a uniqueness to it where animals have similar traits despite vast distances and separation by oceans. So he's seeing the convergence of traits in certain organisms that they really probably aren't very similarly related, but it's the selective pressures from the environment that are actually shaping these traits. And he's seeing the converse as well, where things are diverging based on different selective pressures. We'll get to these finches here in just a minute. So we're going to stop sharing this, and we're then going to we're just going to make a couple of these notations so we don't forget. So again, we're talking about Darwin, Charles Darwin. And we're talking 1809 through 1892. And again, what he did is he circumnavigated the world in 5 years, collecting evidence that species change over time. So he comes home and he actually publishes a book. He actually waits a long time um, until there's actually some other individuals with some similar pieces of work that are thinking the same ideas, and he goes ahead and publishes these ideas in what's called The Origin of Species, his book. Um, and again, we'll look at these finches, the Galapagos finches, and really other organisms on the Galapagos that are all very unique because of these selective pressures, these 13 different species of finch that are called Darwin's finches. We'll talk about that example here shortly. Um, if we look at actually some of these conflicting ideas to Darwin, we kind of arrive at this guy named Lamarck, and he thinks that evolution occurs with kind of effort. And that if these giraffes, so let's say we have these two giraffes, right, and one can reach the leaves and the other can't, Lamarck says that if this other giraffe, if they reach and they reach and they reach, they're going to grow longer necks. And we know that's not how evolution actually works. There has to be variety within a population. And then the selective pressures, in this case, it's the availability of food, will act on that variety. So in this case, we have some giraffes with long necks and some with shorter. Now, it's not these shorter ones reaching that provides them additional ability over time. It's that they die off, right? And we can see that here in the middle picture. Those giraffes that don't have necks long enough to reach the food source will die off. And then the alleles for the ones that have longer necks will be more prevalent in the gene pool. They will survive and reproduce. And then over time, giraffes' necks will be longer because there'll be more individuals with long necked alleles. So what we call that is natural selection. So we're going to go ahead and make a note of that natural selection. And we'll say natural selection is environmental selective pressures they are they act on variation within a species or a population. And what we end up seeing is we see the selection for the most fit. Now, what this means is individuals with the highest reproductive success is fitness in terms of evolution. So it selects the most fit individuals that will survive and reproduce. So that's different than something we call artificial selection. And here we're looking at the emergence of different dog breeds across Europe, North America, China, and India, right? And they're all emerging from the gray wolf. We would call this artificial selection because humans, in this case, are choosing the traits or applying selective pressures that humans are deeming most desirable. It's not really traits that are allowing these dogs to survive because of selective pressures in nature, but it's humans choosing dogs with, certain attributes or things that they deem as being uh, desirable. So we'll go ahead and make a mark on some of these ideas here. So we call this artificial selection. And in this case, it's humans are doing the choosing. So humans are choosing the traits or applying the selective pressures. So again, we see this with dog breeds is a great example throughout human history. We see it with a couple other things as well. We'll look at a couple here. Herbicide resistance, particularly glyphosate, like Roundup, a Bayer product. And then we'll also look at antibiotic resistant bacteria. So antibiotic resistant bacteria would be something like MRSA, methicillin resistant Staphylococcus aureus. We see that has emerged. And then another one called KCP, which occurs in hospitals, post-operative infections typically. So here be an example of this glyphosate resistance. So we can see that, again, we're spraying these fields and the weeds that are at risk and aren't resistant don't have the ability to break down or metabolize this glyphosate compound. They die off, right? So these tall, weedy species here are dying off. And we're seeing species replacement by the smaller, lighter green species of weed that is not resistant, or that is resistant. Sorry, this lighter species here is resistant, so it's going to proliferate and be more prevalent in the gene pool. When we see a field with composed primarily of those species that are resistant. So we see the species shift. We could also see some resistance develop in the same species. So here we have this type of maize. So these, or maybe not maize, I don't know what it is, but these species here, they aren't resistant, so they die off, leaving behind the one with the mutation that is a resistance gene, and then next generation, and population after several years of the selective pressure with the glyphosate, those are the species that then you have. You have the ones that are resistant, and that herbicide no longer is super effective. Here's the antibiotic resistance example. So we have, again, bacteria, some that are resistant, some that aren't. We treat with antibiotics. The antibiotics kill the population of susceptible bacteria, leaving behind the individuals that are resistant, and then future strains are going to be composed primarily of these resistant bacteria. So that would be an example of artificial selection. So let's talk about these finches, this classic example of natural selection. So these Galapagos finches. So we'll give you just a look at this. So with these finches, we've found that there's one species of finch on the mainland of Ecuador, on mainland Ecuador. And this one species traveled, so it made the trip 600 miles across an expanse of ocean to this archipelago we call the Galapagos. And then its descendants then colonize the other islands in that archipelago. And again, we'll get a look at this here in just a second. And we know that because we can sequence the DNA of these finches. So DNA and protein sequences, we can sequence the DNA and protein of of these finches, and we can see that of the 13, they're more similar to each other than they are to anything that's on mainland Ecuador. So they evolved out there on the islands, and we'll get a look at that here. All right, so here's the idea. We have this mainland Ecuadorian finch that makes the trip from the coast of South America to the Galapagos, right? Probably that nearest island. Whether a big storm pushes a group of them out there, they make it there and they start inhabiting all these available niches and utilizing the resources that are there on the Galapagos. And the islands are quite diverse. The topography is different. The area is different. The flora and fauna, the vegetation is different. The food varieties, the predators there are different. So what happened is what we call adaptive radiation, where see a vast number of these finches develop, right? So we have some that feed on cactus, some that feed on insects, some that feed on seeds, some that feed on fruits, some that feed on nectar. And we have, again, the selective pressures really shaping these finch beaks in ways that are going to make it conducive to surviving in their environment, right? So we have this array of species here, right? So we have the all 13 pictured here. So we would say that it's different, again, different selective pressures on each island is driving those adaptations that we see. So it's driving the type of adaptations in those finches. Right, and we have essentially 13 species, and this is called adaptive radiation. Okay, so the question then is, well, what keeps them distinct and separate species? Why don't they converge into a group of 6 species or a smaller group? And the answer is there has to be some reproductive isolation that is occurring there. So reproductive isolation is what is going to keep, or it keeps the species separate and distinct. So we'll look at a couple of different examples of this, but we see that there are certain mating behaviors, like the songs that the individual finches have, that now the medium ground finch will no longer breed with the large ground finch because their mating songs are different. And also the size has an effect. There's a couple called the Grants out of Princeton University that have been going to this island in the Galapagos called Daphne Major for 40 years and studying the size and the composition of the medium, small, and large ground finch. And they see that the medium ground finch does not respond to the song and will not mate with a larger ground finch and vice versa. So they have become distinct species because they no longer will backbreed with one another. Also, geography tends to be a good reproductive barrier, where if you have geographic isolation and you simply don't have access to the other species, that it's unlikely that you will get the convergence of those 2 species. So that's a look at just the introduction to evolution here. I hope that's helpful. I'll see you next time.